Hi everyone, and welcome to this video on question 14, short response question from the Queensland Economics External Exam from 2023. This was an analysis question. It was the fourth of 4 short response questions. Question 14 was worth 13 marks, which means you're going to have to write around 200 words. They gave you 2 pages to write your response to this question on. Question 14 had 3 sources. We'll call them S1, S2 and S3, just to make it easy for ourselves. The data and information shown represent an economic issue in Australia. Once again, another word for issue is always a problem. Okay, it's a problem. What's the problem we're going to find? The final part, which was actually on the second page, is really hard to read this question in the way they set it up in the paper. Analyse the economic issue indicated in the data and economic information provided. So we've got to analyse the issue, the problem. Which policy option should the government implement to improve equity in economic prosperity for all Australians? Which, so we've got to make, whenever we see which, we've got to make a choice. When we make a choice, we're probably going to have to unpack both of them. So let's think about this. Let's break down this question first of all. Let's go and think about the problem. Analyse the economic issue indicated in the information below. So here we've got our S2 and our S3 data sources. What is the problem? What is the issue? How do we know? Justify with data. With the data. And finally, why is it a problem? Why is it a problem? Okay, make meaning. So when we analyse, we can actually use this same little what, how, why sort of setup. If you've watched any of my other videos on analyse writing structures and targets, you'll see down the bottom here the setup I've used previously, and it all kind of starts to overlap. Trends, patterns, similarities, differences, what's going on, what's the problem. Step 2, quantify and calculate. Use the data. How do we know? How does the data tell us that? How does it link back to the theory? Why is it a problem? Why is this happening? What's the effect? What's the link back to economic theory? So remember, we've got a question. I'm going to write in big words over on the top right hand side here around equity. And we're looking to improve equity. Now, if we look at source number 2 to begin with, we start to see 3 different age groups. Baby boomers, Generation X and millennials. Always remember to read every little part of your data. Estimated Australians, over here on the left on the vertical axis, estimated Australians without superannuation in 2023 as a percent. Now we can see that our women, really high. Men, baby boomers, they seem to have in 2023, 70% of male baby boomers have superannuation accounts. Okay, people born before 1965 in 2023 for women, only about 20% of women have, just over 20% of women have superannuation accounts. The grey area represents those without superannuation accounts. So what we're really focusing on is this section here. Okay, Gen X. Compulsory superannuation introduced in 1992. Gen X, we start to see now that more and more people in the workforce taking on superannuation. And we see that for each generation moving forward, we see that the percentage that don't have superannuation accounts is dropping. Always read your little bits at the bottom. The introduction of compulsory superannuation in 1992 incentivised more Australians to save for retirement. The nature of compounding magnifies the effect of early contributions to superannuation. So when you're young, any dollar you put in superannuation, the compound interest paid on that is worth more than the dollar that you put in your 50s. You won't get as much compound interest on that. We're still trying to figure out what the issue is. Source number 3. We see that we've got, once again, women and men and women and men. So we're talking about equity. Really, I think that this is a question around gender income, gender-derived income equity. It's not about different groups, baby boomers versus Gen X. It's men and women and the outcomes that they might face. And we start to see here estimated work arrangements in Australia. We see women in 1990 to now. So we can look at a trend now from 1990 to 2020. We can start to pick up on our trends. Women, full-time work, 30% of women were in full-time work, 40% were part-time, and 30% were casual. Okay, so what we have here is that we could say that, 70% of women were actually underemployed. Now, since the amount of superannuation you put into your account is linked to your level of income, if you are underemployed, then you aren't maximising your superannuation savings for later in life. Men, 70% full-time work and only 30% here were underemployed. If we look to 2020, we start to see that women, whilst we see an increase in women, there is a positive there. There is an increase in women from 30 to 45%, so that's good. More women actualising more superannuation savings. We still have more than half, 55%, more than half, still aren't actualising the most amount of superannuation contributions that they potentially could. Okay. The problem really sits around the older women. Older women, baby boomers, your parents' generation and before, who often stayed home and looked after kids. Older women don't have the savings available in retirement that men of the same era had. Okay? Now, as compulsory superannuation was introduced, we now see that most people, working people, or all working people now mandatory must have a superannuation account. But the first thing we have to think about is, what is the issue? And how do we use the data to do our step number 2 to justify it? How do we know this is a problem? And what would be the effects of this problem? So now we're starting to say we've got an issue here around older women specifically, women, less super. So that's the gender income equity part, but younger women are still affected. And I would go through and break down every bit of data to some degree that you could, okay? If in doubt and you don't know how to answer it, go through and find your trends down the bottom here, your patterns, your similarities, your differences. Do you quantify and you calculate? Make some inferences. It almost doesn't matter what it is. If you're completely lost, make sure you break down your data, okay? But step 1, you've got to go down and after breaking down that data, the first thing you write is, what is the overall issue? And the overall issue here, very messy little page this one. I'm sorry about that, guys. Older women, less super, young women is still affected, but the situation is improving. Okay, so the economic issue is around equity and the lack of superannuation savings. That's my analyse, the first part of the question. Analyse the economic issue indicated in the data and the economic information provided. It's my little section right at the top here. Okay, moving on. The second part of the question, over here in the writing yellow, which policy option should the government implement to improve equity in economic prosperity for all Australians? And this one here is what we referred to as source 1 earlier on. And it gives you a preamble once again to help you understand superannuation. Superannuation is a percentage payment from current income by an employee. The purpose is to save for a future income in retirement. And then there's 2 policy options. Women given an incentive to top up personal superannuation accounts, or a 5-year income tax discount to older women if they pay significantly more into the superannuation fund each year. Okay, so here we have a solution. We've actually found this issue from our data. but they actually signposted it there for you in source 1. The tricky one with this question is that they didn't lay out the data in terms of problem policy. They laid it out as policy and then problem. And that's why this one here, we're calling it source 1. Policy option 2, a one-off taxation levy for low superannuation balances. All Australians pay an additional tax on their income to fix an identified inequity. So all Australians would be asked to pay a bit more money, a bit more higher tax to go towards, to be redistributed towards those who haven't had the same level of superannuation savings as others. Now the question here says, which policy option should the government implement to improve equity? Remember, as economists look at both sides. Okay, just through my reading of them here, you might have actually started to say, that sounds like a pretty good option. And you might be thinking to yourself, the other one doesn't sound as good. I'm going to focus on advocating for one of these policies. Now, economists look at both sides. I would recommend that always, when you get these ones with two options, knowing how the QCAA likes you to do this, is think about the costs of this policy as well as the benefits of this policy. Policy option 2, before you argue one is better than the other, make sure you identify a cost or a benefit of both. Okay? This will help you to really look at both sides of the argument. And from there, you start to come to a decision using reason, logic, and evidence. Okay, so you may want to say, well, look, here's the costs and benefits of policy option 1, policy option 2, and then you'll finish with your final decision using some reasoning. Well, I think this one here is probably a better way to go for these reasons, and bring yourself to a conclusion around that there. Okay, but I would definitely think that if you have two policy options, when you analyse these policies and it says which policy option, look at both sides. So here's the marking guide of this question. And you'll see it's quite comprehensive. The first step, economic issue. Identifies the economic issue. We found that the older people uses data to quantify the problem for older Australians. The scale of superannuation problem over time, source 2. Okay. Now, this is a really granular question, a marking guide. Okay. In the analysis section here, there's a pattern about superannuation using data. Okay, that's just going to get you 1 mark. You just find a pattern, use some data, you get that mark. Even if you really don't understand the question, break down the data. Draws meaning from insufficient retirement funds. What does it mean when people don't have adequate money for their retirement? It means they live at a very low standard of living, and it also means that the government may have to support them with further welfare or transfer payments. Uses data from casual and part-time work in 2020 and 1990. Once again, patterns and trends, looking at those differences. This is a really tricky one. I kind of mentioned it, didn't I? Identifies that female retirement savings has improved over time using data. Okay, that's the sort of dot point that really starts to separate people's level of holistic understanding of economics. Okay, our next step there, the second part of the question, is option 1 and option 2. So if you just argued that, say, option 1 was your preference, you actually cut yourself out for 3 marks straight away. Option 1 describes a cost, describes a benefit, and makes a decision comparing it to option 2 using some economic reasoning, logic, and evidence. And option 2 describes a cost and a benefit and makes some decision comparing it to the other one. Both of those policies do have pros and cons. The question is, have you considered both those pros and cons, and have you argued for and against them based on the other option? So that wraps up question 14, everyone. If you have any questions on that, feel free to put them in the comments below. Okay, all the best with your upcoming studies.